You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production. You'll be learning key insights for vertical farming success from leading industry operators, growers, and executives. If you're a grower or owner looking to optimize your existing or new indoor cultivation facility, or anyone looking to cultivate more in less space, we've got you covered. Cultivation Elevated, sponsored by Pipp Horticulture.
All right, welcome to another episode of Cultivation Elevated, sponsored by Pipp Horticulture. I'm your host, Michael Williamson, and I'm honored to be here with Mr. James Cunningham of Fog City Farms. And you are kind of the OG of vertical farming in California and in general. You were facility number 1 for Pipp. Tell me all about how you got to that point of meeting Pipp and making that leap of faith from single tier to a double tiered environment.
Sure. Yeah. There were a couple other groups that were working on it at the same time as us. We went through and looked at some plans and had seen some compelling evidence that LEDs had really joined the show, because that was obviously the catalyst that pushed us in that direction. Coming from the HID world, where we grew in the traditional market for over a decade previous, we were used to what we were used to, with LEDs really kind of joining the show and having a lesser heat load, we naturally started thinking about going vertical. And at the time, there weren't really very many options from a platform perspective, so we started going down that rabbit hole of looking into mobile storage applications, different high volume mobile racking solutions. And, the same 3 big players were there. We ended up stumbling on Pipp's website, and actually my partner Kelly kind of pushed me in that direction, and turned out Pipp had just started thinking about going into that direction. And so we all got together and designed Pipp's first ever horticultural racking platform at Fog City Farms. It's an interesting process, and getting all of that installed, getting all of that marketing, stuff, and both for Fog City and for Pipp. And it was really fun all in all.
Awesome. Tell me, if you can, for our audience who may not be familiar with Fog City, can you kind of give me a verbal visual aid of, your infrastructure, where you're located, and the mission of the brand?
Yeah, we're in Santa Cruz County, specifically the city of Watsonville. This is the central coast of California, where we wake up every day to a very thick marine layer, I'd say in certain areas, almost 3/4 of the year, Very often that marine layer burns off by midday, but it makes farming outdoors and in greenhouses an interesting process in our region. A lot of that, presents its fair amount of difficulties, but it also presents some benefits in our local opinion from a quality perspective and a terroir perspective. But it also drove a lot of us into farming indoors to create, a consistent product 365 days a year, along with the fact that California in the Prop 215 days, Santa Cruz was an early adopter of pretty lenient medicinal laws. So a lot of us were raised with the ability to cultivate 100 square feet per script, So, it's a funny culture here there in Santa Cruz, where you've got this kind of naturally kind of progressive thinking. There's a lot of horticulture going on in the South County region and into Salinas and the rest of the Central Coast. And that led towards a lot of us being on the front end of a lot of, big cannabis movements in the space.
Yeah, I lived down the street from Fog City for several years, and I was a transplant to California, but living in that area and seeing that level of big ag with Driscoll's and a lot of the big leafy green players that are in town, a lot of people are so disconnected with their food. So it was really interesting on a daily basis to drive past these places and see the steps they take, the equipment they use, the hours they work, and what it takes to actually put food on a plate for someone. It's a really unique area.
Definitely. And they've gotten to the point where that marine layer and that fog and those nighttime temperatures are the reasons why they grow certain varieties in that region.
Right. It's beneficial to them.
Exactly. Right.
As a grower in the Salinas Valley for a couple of years, the fog was something that I didn't understand or wasn't really aware of going into that. And I didn't realize how significant it was going to impact total DLI on my crop every day, really.
Right.
So that probably pushed it with a big push to go indoors with Fog City.
Definitely. I mean, if you need a certain amount of production in order to be relevant, and it's not that you can't get that production with supplemental light, and in the valley, it's a stronger photo period than it is on the coast, but there's no way you're going to be able to compete with the regions in Southern California from a photo period perspective, or even north of the Central Coast. So, but then again, you do get some very high quality production sometimes because of that filtered light, and those temperatures as well that come along with it. But yeah, that was a big driver into farming indoors for a lot of us for years. And naturally, when California was, going recreational and adapting, or adopting all these laws, I started thinking about the market and what drove the market in California and what you could build a brand off of. And really, I kept coming across, this idea of consistency in my mind, creating a consistent product 365 days a year. And the only way that you can do that is indoors. Even in the better, greenhouse climates, you can create very high quality product, but you're still subject to fluctuating light intensities, temperatures, and different things in the natural world, no matter how intelligent that greenhouse is, And so, that when I'm seeing, football fields and football fields of greenhouse and outdoor being fired up everywhere throughout the state, I, in my mind, was saying, you know what, let's do a smaller, more controllable footprint and build a brand around this thing, And so that was really the idea behind Fog City Farms, because I'd been stocking the shelves in California for over a decade before that, and, more isn't always better. And that's that kind of like American ideal, right? That people are, oh, it's legal now. We can grow, acres of greenhouse. And so, but how much can the state actually consume, And obviously that brings a whole nother question about where a lot of that product was going and an unrealistic expectation based off of the distribution models that, throughout the last few years. But I feel like it's really settling now. The consumer's getting more educated, and, the smaller, more controllable production models that have developed brands around what they're doing are really well suited to weather this storm that we're seeing in the cannabis space, not just in California, but, on a national level.
We're seeing it everywhere.
Yeah.
Obviously the newer states who are coming up, that's a different story. They have a different, I kind of look at it like a baseball inning, they're like an inning one
Right.
before things
Exactly,
market,
right.
but we look at mature states like Colorado, California, of course, Oregon, Washington, even Michigan now. And yeah, there's a lot of price compression and things are tighter, but at the same time too, there has to be winners and losers. There's a lot of people in the cannabis space that got into it for the wrong reasons, who
Right.
haven't really paid their dues and saw it as a quick buck. And I think you're seeing some form of natural selection kind of going on
It's a great way to
in
put
the
it.
state. And, it can be discouraging. It's obviously hard if you're raising money right now or expanding an operation that is successful. But at the end of the day, there's going to be winners. People have to win.
Right.
It just depends on how far do you want to take it and how much do you want to bleed for this plant,
Right. How natural is this for you,
Yeah.
And like,
where's your comfort,
can you be here for the next 25 years? Can you be here for your entire career? And there isn't really much else that makes more sense for me. So I'm home here, and I feel like our entire team is poised to do just that and compete with this market and carve out our niche. We don't really feel like we're competing with anybody as long as we just stay true to ourselves and create a following for our culture and our main, staples as a brand, which are quality and consistency. You can rely on us, when you want, and if you look at other consumable markets, when you get a bottle of water even, you get what you expect, like, smart water is smart water every single time. If you want a Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola every single time. The cannabis industry has kind of been missing that a little bit, and so we have, our staple strains that are built off of our legacy in operations in California, which are, very much, rooted in that OG lineage couple things that we've bred with a breeding project that we've done out in Maui with our family out there, and some things that we're working on with other local breeders that are going to be mainstays, and they're going to be reliable, you know, from a production and from a consumer expectation perspective. And so that's the main goal for us at this point, is to create something that you can rely on a regular basis.
I couldn't agree more, and I saw that in the early days of the medical market in Colorado when I was operating there, is especially people who had very specific reasons for using cannabis, who were really frustrated with, like, the inconsistency of batch to batch, and they're like, "Oh, that one worked perfectly," and then, they try the same thing, and they're like, "This one didn't work. What'd you do different?" And back then, we weren't capturing any data. I didn't know what I did different. I mean, we were just shoestringing things together back then, So, yeah, it was really frustrating as an owner of a business, but also really frustrating for our customers and our patients. So but the same thing's true now in recreational. People are used to consistency. If I'm gonna and wine's a great example, but wine also,
There's some fluctuations.
there's some
year to year.
fluctuations.
Right.
There can be bad batches that you don't realize. That's what I always think is funny about people who have really fancy wine collections, and they'll get out that expensive bottle and they'll open it up and it'll gone rotten or bad on them and they're bummed, but I think that's part of the treasure hunting, so to speak.
Right.
You guys are a fascinating company because you kind of had some big stones. You guys had some confidence. You did things that had never been done before, and you essentially built a strong brand off of, as you would say, a glorified R&D facility.
Mhm.
So, can we talk a little bit about that transition from, it sounds like you guys at one point had mocked something up in the barn
Right.
and said, "Hey, this works. I can do this," and maybe visited a place or two and got to take a deeper dive with, probably, I imagine, Fluence at the time, because they were kind of that pioneer breakthrough company in LED lighting that kind of paved the road for a lot of vertical farming advancements. But yeah, walk me through that story a little bit of going from, "I think we can do this," to, "Hey, I've got this spot in Watsonville now and let's go."
Right. Well, first off, we definitely had our hearts in our throats for almost 2 years and designing and actually following through with the plan. But, again, back to the beginning, we started seeing that LEDs were really kind of making some noise. And until that point, LEDs really were just kind of synonymous with larvae, underdeveloped product in my eyes, And I didn't quite understand why at that point, because I didn't, I knew what I was good at, but I didn't necessarily understand the science behind it like I do now. And so naturally, learning from experience and putting my hands on the thing, I called Fluence and said, "Hey, where can I see this in action?" And we went up to Washington and toured some grows. I went out to Colorado and toured some grows. And what I noticed was that a lot of these farmers understood the science behind lighting. They understood the efficiencies of scaled farming, but they had less experience with the genetics in the plant than we did. And so I started instantly thinking about genetics that would work well in this vertical space. And what I've since learned, just to jump forward a little bit, is that I can grow anything in the vertical space. You just have to plan accordingly, But right off the bat, I was thinking about things that would be more manageable, genetics that would work. And we set up a research and development in my barn. And it was interesting because we weren't able to go vertical in the way that we were going to be modeling for in the actual cultivation. So we set up a vertical space in a very close proximity, 8-foot ceilings,
Okay, sure.
And
Really pushing. And you had 2 tiers?
in 2 tiers,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think my first go around was like
No 1 week veg.
50 plants per tray. Like,
Yeah,
it was crazy, But it was in the true spirit of R&D. It was fun. And what we realized is that we were going to run into significant issues in controlling our environment, especially, when we get more than a couple racks in any one space, right? And so we, right off the bat, the plants were vegging beautifully. We saw great flower set, and, the LEDs were super promising from a plant development perspective. But we started seeing inconsistencies in our environment. And for me, the first step is always controlling my environment. You could have the best lights, the best genetics, the best nutrient regimen, integrated pest management practices, but none of that is going to work for you if you're not in the correct environment. In my opinion, it's always the first step in designing the grow. And so, I've started looking into what my options were for inter-rack canopy, airflow, and there weren't any at the time. A lot of the studies that were being done with a lot of the larger educational institutions were just using methods that weren't going to be adequate for cannabis being a long life cycle, high light intensity plant.
Yeah, it's like clip-on fans and whatever you could, any kind of fan you could find that you could somehow attach to the rack, which always seemed to be pretty hokey and
low voltage stuff.
yeah, there wasn't really any consistency to it. Not like how a greenhouse fan design would be, as an example. There wasn't like a lot of strategy, it seemed, in the early days behind people trying to move air in a rack.
Exactly, totally.
And just didn't know.
No, for sure, they didn't know, and they didn't necessarily have the funding to develop a large scale solution like this. Whereas right off the bat, this crop was going to generate some revenue, and everybody knew that. So we were throwing more money at these projects and a lot of the other indoor farming applications or other crops that, that were being developed at the time. So we could justify it. And so, I had gone to a friend who worked in sheet metal, my partner at Vertical Air Solutions, which we'll get at in a minute, and we developed the first ever kind of bolt-on airflow solution for vertical farming. And that was Vertical Air Solutions, which is a division of Pipp Horticulture now, obviously. And it's been a pretty unbelievable journey in going from that garage and figuring out airflow, figuring out plant densities, light intensities, which is something that's interesting when you're dealing with a light that has much more available photons. You start seeing these different light stresses that you're not used to, at lower temperatures. There's more available light. You're stimulating transpiration in a way that you aren't under HIDs, even though there is more radiant heat in the space with HIDs, and it's kind of a deceiving platform, And so we went from there to trying to design this thing at scale and make our best, stab at designing the, 4,000 square feet of canopy as essentially our, initial cultivation, facility that we were going to build our brand off of, but also a model that we were going to be able to expand off of in the future when we expand up to, 30,000 square feet. Obviously, since then, the California market has changed and there's facilities that need retrofitting and that are coming available. So the expansion has changed. The expansion plans have changed a little bit.
Expansion strategy, right? Look at distressed assets now.
But nonetheless, that glorified research and development zone has exceeded all of our expectations. And we're 5 years in now in operating the first ever installed multi-tier growing platform. There was one other group in San Francisco that was installed before us, but I don't know of any other vertical farms installed in this.
Not that were mobile,
right?
Static stuff,
Not
of
exactly,
course,
not a
and
mobile
people
one.
buying,
Right.
U-line and bulk rack storage and kind of doing what we used to do.
Right.
It's interesting that we both share this odd parallel past story of we were starting a cannabis business, a legal one, and you almost got distracted with another company. And
Right.
For me, it was greenhouse industries and the trays. We were doing a 90,000 square foot indoor facility, and I knew that my rationale, and this was pre-LED, I was T5 vegging, but I said, I can double stack my mom's, I can double or triple stack my veg, and I can have more room for flower. And to me, that made sense. And so I looked out on different solutions that I was looking for. I was really tired of cleaning your traditional ABS trays and watching all the headaches I had from a grower standpoint and gripe standpoint and sanitation standpoint, and was looking for like an easy to clean, durable, for life tray, essentially. And I had no intentions of creating the tray to sell to the market. So I don't know, when you guys first did the air circulation thing, was it really for yourself at first, or were you thinking like, this is going to be for us, but then we're taking it to market?
No, yeah, it was a solution that we were building for our facility.
For you, right?
Yeah.
So same for me. And then I had a couple growers come through and see what I was doing, and they were like, "Whoa, where'd you get this racking and these trays?" I was like, "Well, I had them fabricated out of sheet metal."
Right.
And they were like, "Oh, can I buy them?" And I was like, "Oh no, they're not for sale." And it wasn't until the third grower basically said, "Can I buy these?" And I was like, "Oh shit."
Mhm.
we've got to, because when you're starting a cannabis business in any state, it's stressful. There's so much to pay attention to. You're so focused.
Oh, yeah.
And all of a sudden, here comes this, what's seemingly a distraction on the side, but it's also an important thing that you need to do the thing that you're trying to do.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, oh, here's another company you just started that you had not planned for, didn't really have funding for. I mean, there's so many challenges there, but it's really interesting that, because we didn't know each other previous
Right.
to getting together through Pipp. And then we both end up selling our companies with Pipp too, which is kind of funny.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was an unbelievable bonus to this entire Fog City journey. Obviously, you don't expect to develop something like that going into this, but it's always refreshing when guys like us from the traditional market are able to put our stamp on a new industry where we're surrounded by, crop scientists and engineers and all these new, minds that are getting involved to further advance, the development of this plant that we've been growing forever, and there were certain things that folks weren't necessarily thinking about in regards to powdery mildew and botrytis and other pathogen development in the space, and so the first step for me has always been just control the environment.
Well, we see things, especially you, see things through a whole different lens. As an owner-operator, you can have all the degrees you want, and this looks good on paper and all that stuff, but until you've really done it and battled all the battles, like,
Right,
you see things differently.
definitely.
So you saw a hole in the market and you went for it.
Right.
At what point were you like, I need to bring VAS to life?
I'd say early on in research and development, we realized we had something special. And so we definitely did not develop it thinking that we were going to be producing a product for the market. But very early on, I realized that there weren't any options. And so that other vertical farm that had got fired up right before Fog City Farms, they ended up buying the equipment from us because they were having such difficulty with their system. If you understand the racking world, you know that a lot of the supports and the diagonal bracing and things like that are in traditional racking carriages and vertical supports, they impede any sort of bolt-on sort of solutions for airflow or even other, solutions that have been developed in the vertical farming space. So it was interesting. We were only able to install half of our system. We did one of the ducting runs consistently on the same side throughout the entire grow. And it was like, because there was diagonal, bracing.
Sure, that was blocking it. And there was no way to do it on the back end because it was too tight on the wall.
And it was still, it improved things, considerably. Yeah. But, even since then, we, not to get too far off the Fog City thing, but we've been refining the solution and really studying airflow in a way that hasn't really been done before, in horticulture period, and so we're going to have some very interesting studies coming out in the next year or so that really look at terpenes and other secondary metabolite production in the plant and how airflow can affect those things. A lot of our expectations have been set by this, hydro store model of like what's available. And a lot of growers are like, man, I want to see my plants just,
it's because it's familiar.
Yeah,
just dancing.
blasted,
Yeah.
And it's not that they don't need to be dancing a little bit, arguably, but really you just want to kind of get rid of that vapor barrier at canopy, make sure that you're destratifying the microclimate, helping your HVAC system create consistency throughout the space. And, back to the Fog City thing, I mean, we had no models to develop.
No, you were blazing a brand new trail.
Our HVAC system isn't supplied perfectly, at this point, but we make it work because Vertical Air Solutions is definitely supplementing any shortcomings that we had in our HVAC design, right? And we figured out that if we supplied our conditioned and dehumidified air at lower elevations and made it more ready for Vertical Air Solutions to bring that pool of ambient kind of conditioned air and supply it to the bottom tiers, we were, going to create much more consistency throughout the space. And so
what you just said is pretty big. It's amazing how people are like, oh, I'm really struggling with vertical farming. I don't think it works. And it always boils down to the same root cause analysis of your HVAC was poorly engineered or undersized, or not distributed appropriately, or the returns are in the wrong location, or your air exchanges aren't abundant enough. And so I don't know, I just can't stress the critical importance of really working with the right HVAC companies and engineers and growers who understand actual transpiration, because there seems to be a massive amount of disconnect specifically around managing relative humidity.
Definitely. Yeah. And there's multiple approaches towards it. And usually that's based on scale, you know. Really, you need to pull the moisture out of the space. You pull the moisture out of the space by cooling the air and condensing, But you need to do it at such a rate that you undoubtedly are going to have to reheat that air. And so how you reheat that air many times can dictate your decision in HVAC. And so at smaller scales, you can use a simpler system. At larger scales, much like this hotel, you need to do a more complex
Sure.
solution. And so
You guys have worked through a lot of different genetics, and it was really interesting to hear what you said earlier today, was that now you can grow anything. When you first started focusing on vertical farming, you were like thinking, all right, I have to, really focus on stuff that isn't as stretchy, a form factor or plant structure that really works in whatever the elevations that you have. So right now at Fog City, you're running a 12-foot rack, and you have 2 tiers in flower. So what does that roughly give you between
got
bottom of
about
tray?
just under 5 feet on the bottom tier and around 7 feet.
So you target like what, a 36-inch to 48-inch plant or something in that range, finished product?
Yep.
Yeah. Which is probably a bit different than how you were growing before.
Definitely, yeah. So you have to time it adequately. And I mean, it still will sneak up on us sometimes, but we've gotten much better at timing things because we do all of our veg in greenhouses. So we also have to time it based off of annual light intensity fluctuations,
Yeah, you just want to throw an extra factor in
which
the
is
equation.
interesting, that's a whole another thing. But like we have gotten to the point where you come in there sometimes and it looks like there's a laser level, across that thing, which really kind of is a great result of moving into the vertical farming space. Like you can achieve a consistency that you can't achieve in other growing platforms. The distance between your light bars and the throw and intersecting lighting patterns, is so consistent throughout the space that you get very consistent development. Vertical air solutions providing a blanket of laminar airflow across the space, It's a very consistent platform for producing, product that fits very well into a brand, and we've got like 5 to 10% smalls on good rounds, and so that's we've got a lot of jarable flower.
Can we talk a little bit about, it's a hot topic, can we talk a little bit about the state of California in terms of kind of market and what we're seeing overall in terms of whatever you're comfortable sharing, price points, buyer trends, what does survival in California look like during this time?
Fog City is definitely on the smaller scale of production, but we have a very healthy brand, right? And so, in my opinion, from the very beginning, many of these larger farms, they were going to succeed in driving the wholesale market down, but potentially have the same amount of branded flower that a small group like Fog City has in the market. And so, in my opinion, the only way to find security in the market in California is to build a brand, right? And in order to build a brand, you have to have a very consistent production. And that's why we went indoors, which is what we spoke about previously. We are dealing with a complete oversaturation of the market. There's 1,000 times too much, more product being produced in California that can be consumed.
And that's not the growers' fault.
No.
That's the state regulators.
Yeah, of course.
That's a state issue.
Totally. Yeah. And so, over the next couple of years, you're going to see a significant amount of failure from groups that are producing too much product, and they're just going to be buried in product that they can't sell because they overestimated what they were going to be able to sell in the market. Unfortunately, there are going to be some smaller legacy operators that also will fail because they believe that just good, high quality product was always going to have a premium always demand a premium in the wholesale space, which hasn't been the case when you have, hundreds of thousands of square feet of indoor in the desert and different places, just driving that indoor market down.
Especially if their cost of goods sold is high right now, and they didn't
Exactly.
focus on their efficiencies. That makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. I mean, those legacy operators might have more of a home in the market in the coming years, when the market really does start to get more educated in where product is coming from, similar to grapes and wine. But unfortunately, the wholesale market doesn't necessarily care if indoor purple gassy weed comes from, a large scale warehouse in the desert or a small scale grow in Mendocino, or a boutique grow in LA. And so figuring out how to weather this storm is something, it's a common term in the state right now. This is we have the most densely populated grower population, I'd say, than anywhere else in the country.
I can't remember the stats, but it used to be like there was 49,000 illegal growers in California in 2015, and I'm like, who took this survey?
Right.
I'm like, no growers I know would answer this question, but
Sure.
so who knows how many? But it's amazing. I mean, you guys, there's nothing else, no other state like California when it comes to, growers.
Right. And they had to kind of take that approach towards legalization. They had to give everybody a chance, right? And there were a lot of people from outside the industry that were looking at an opportunity that also took advantage of the way they structured that and developed at scales that were unprecedented and not sustainable. So you're going to see groups that are able to withstand losses because of funding, and they'll stick around
They'll just take
and
the
weather the
hits.
storm that way. But, unfortunately, a lot of the middle scale, growers are going to end up taking some really big hits that may not be sustainable. Many of the large scale growers that didn't understand the industry are all going to go away, I think.
Well, the hits are interesting because it wasn't like it all happened overnight. It's like everyone's been taking some punches. I remember when I was operating in California, I saw a lot of flexibility or elasticity in the price on a greenhouse grown product after 1 year.
Hmm.
And I was like, man, I'm used to, maybe $100 or $200 or a point or two, but to see it go from, I think, like 1,600 to 800, I was like, oh, that's terrifying. That like red flag. I need to understand that more. We talked a little bit earlier about, and maybe you can touch base at a high level on kind of some of the history of California and how price has been impacted by things like light dep, as an example. And then we saw there was some price impacts from the autoflower development.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, indoor tends to be the most stable place, especially high quality indoor, if you can establish a brand around a fair amount of it and then service other people's brands. But it still gets affected by the huge seasonal waves that come from the premier light dep season, that one greenhouse, full-term greenhouse season that produces super high quality. And really, the outdoor season, I only know a couple very high-end, high-end operators that still have found a life in the outdoor space. And many of the other farmers are having a very difficult time. I've heard that up to 75% of the licenses didn't renew this year
Well,
for outdoor and greenhouse,
it's because they can scale so quickly.
Yeah.
And that's not a good thing always.
It's kind of consolidated to a few very good operators, And so I think we're just going to see that consolidation happen. We're going to see this big shaking out in the industry, and the ones that are able, that understand the plant and are able to compete or willing to compete,
Sure.
are going to be the ones that are left.
Something on outdoor too that I always thought about, and I think in a perfect world, which is not the world that we live in today, I think I would love living organic soil, outdoor, California sunshine, the right genetics. That sounds delicious. But I can't help but think about all the contaminants that exist in an outdoor environment. It's almost like, think about if you left your car outside and didn't wash it you might be able to do this right now, literally, think about it, but for 3 months or 4 months, think about how much it's just covered.
Totally.
There's in layers of grime and dirt and animal byproducts and just stuff.
Right.
So that was something about outdoor. I was always like, I love the idea of it in some aspects, but there's also a component to where I'm like, there's a lot of other stuff stuck to this plant.
Definitely, yeah. And cannabis is different than other outdoor crops that, to use the wine example again, it's like you're processing these grapes and you're creating, you know, wine out of this fruit. And so a lot of that exposed, all the exposed parts of the plant are gone at that point. Not that you're not still getting all of that in the juice, you are, but
Well,
wine also ages better, with time, and cannabis doesn't, and so the outdoor space and the greenhouse space is undoubtedly going to get into issues with storage and preserving product, because in my opinion, contrary to what maybe some of the guys up north might say, oxidation is not a good thing when it comes down to flowers, which is another reason why we went indoors, to create this, weekly fresh drop of product, and so you're always getting a fresh product from us, and so, in the outdoor space, it, I think at some point that terroir element is going to come into the market, and you'll have smaller batch seasonal crops that drive a fair amount of value, but I just think the market's pretty far from that at this point. And, and really, I don't see there being, a huge market for that. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens when certain genetics are discovered to do better in certain regions, and express different, terpene production based off of region and temperatures, light intensities, and things like that. But I think we're pretty far from that, and, who knows how that's going to shake out.
It's interesting, the connection, and you have a family connection to Hawaii, but there's a rich history between Santa Cruz specifically, but California in general, the surfing community, and cannabis and genetics between Hawaii and Santa Cruz.
Mhm.
I came in really late to everything, so I got to kind of learn from people who were, the old timers who were telling stories and stuff. But there's some legendary stories that,
Yeah,
hail from both those areas.
definitely.
How much of the Fog City Farms branding would you say the importance really relies on what's in the jar as far as like genetics? Like when you talk about building a quality brand, how much of that is just the genetics itself? Would you say if you had to like give it a percentage rate, is it,
I mean, it's
low or is it significant?
no, I'd say at least 50% of the potential in quality product comes from the genetics.
That's significant.
That's significant. But the other 50% it's a very touchy, very fragile portion of the pie, right? So like when if your environmentals get out of whack, if you have any sort of, reservoir or
One kind of clog, leak, pump, go out.
or contamination or anything like that, then all of a sudden that consistency is out of whack and that genetic's not going to carry you through, So there are some genetics that have a higher fitness than others, but they don't tend to be the most desirable genetics, just like in wine, you want that Pinot Noir grown in the, coastal mountain range of Santa Cruz. And the reason why you want it is because it's very difficult to grow, but the flavor expression is unbelievable, And so with a lot of these OGs that we grew up growing, that we're partial to, we've left our stamp on saying like, some of these genetics are available to everybody, but we do them better. And that's because we understand how to control our environments. We understand timing. We understand drying times and curing. We understand, how much of it we should jar, not to say we don't slip up every once in a while, and get a little over ambitious in jarring something, end up, needing to figure out how to sell through in different ways, just like any other, commodity-based market in the world,
Especially emerging where there's like the level of learning,
Exactly, right.
like on the job training.
Totally, yeah, and it's same with horticultural issues. We've had, different issues along the way that come along with operating a facility for 5 years. Before this in the traditional market, you'd be lucky to get 3 years out of any one facility, and
Oh,
so
you're lucky if you get a couple turns out of a
Ex
spot sometimes where you have to
exactly.
break it down again.
Right, and so when you've got equipment and investors and the plant doesn't stop growing and all of these things to manage at this point in a real business setting, it becomes really interesting. And I'd say that, the genetics are definitely the backbone. And this year we're going to be developing a fair amount of genetics and doing partnerships with other breeders to to add to that exclusive offering, but there are certain OG lineages that are just, in my opinion, as the genetic pool just gets so vast and fairly unstable, that I just
Inbred.
exactly right. You stick to those things and you create something consistent at a very high quality, and people are gonna be drawn to it.
Yeah, it's interesting, all the iconic flavors of gas and fruit and cake and candy, but like it's some things just don't change.
Mhm.
There are these like spotting trends and people hype things, but I mean, you give me the right OG Kush from California, and I'm gonna pick that over everything every time,
Right.
most of the time.
Definitely. I feel the same
You
way.
know,
Yep.
I remember talking to my brother-in-law Drew, and I remember at one point he was like, "I should have just grown OG Kush," But I think like most growers, especially when you're given a good amount of space in a greenhouse, you want to pheno hunt. It's like investors are now savvy that like, oh, R&D, pheno hunting, like, yeah, like maybe in phase 2, they've had
Mhm.
some hard lessons for different reasons because there's risk involved and it doesn't always add immediate value to an investor's pocket. But if you're building a brand or trying to just compete in the market, that can be the difference between success and failure in some cases. If you have something really special that nobody else has and you do it at a high level. You said something earlier that I like a lot is people are trying to compete with other people, and sometimes it's okay to grow the same thing as someone else. And now this is your opportunity to be like, "Oh yeah, you grow whatever." Like I grow whatever like you've never seen it before.
Right.
And then the consumer goes, "That's whatever? I've had whatever for years. I've never had whatever like this."
Right.
The Fog City whatever is, the best I've ever had. Then now they're turned on to your other. Now they're like, "Oh, what else is Fog City working on?" Because if
Right.
they're growing this at this level and they have some proprietary stuff, like I got to check that out.
Right. And we definitely have proprietary stuff. And even some of our OG genetics or OG based genetics are very exclusive. And so we just like to have our hands in everything. We have strains that are, that are completely proprietary to us. Speaking of the Maui breeding project. But again, there are some of those genetics that are available to everybody that are just unbelievable. And as things get a little bit muddier in the genetic pool, you know, I like to stick to some of those tried and trues.
Yeah, well, but talk is cheap, so it's nice when you can just like be like, "Show me your blue dream," or whatever it might
Whatever it
be,
is,
right?
sure.
Yeah, I'll show
Mhm.
you mine, and
Yeah,
and you kind of sit down and smoke and look at test scores or whatever it is, and go,
that would be a classic competition.
"Yeah."
Blue Dream.
It's interesting. So, we get so focused on cultivation, and I see a ton of great people growing great cannabis. It seems like post-harvest processing is where quality is either made or make it or
Sure.
break it, essentially.
Mhm.
And we put so much energy, money, capital, equipment, and focus on cultivation, but now more and more people are really realizing that you have to go back to some of your traditional roots of proper dry and cure. There's so much stuff that, looks pretty good on the vine, so to speak, but man, once it gets in the jar, it's like whatever you captured in cultivation has been lost in
Definitely.
post-harvest. What kind of stuff are you guys working on? You guys have a new facility coming.
Right. Yeah.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So as far as drying and curing goes, something I learned a long time ago is that heat degrades terpenes, right? And so in the drying space, it's almost unavoidable at a certain scale. You know, you have to introduce heat to the space in order to control the, you know, botrytis and make sure that you're not going to get bud rot throughout your entire space at scale. And so many of the larger scaled grows are introducing heat into the dry space, and that's why the nose doesn't come through, because you're essentially degrading terpenes in that process. I like to dry for 10 to 15 days at 60 degrees and 60% relative humidity.
The classic recipe for success.
Exactly, and it's very difficult at a certain scale, right? So in this next expansion, we're just adding on another 5,000 square feet of canopy. So we're going to essentially be at 10,000 square feet of canopy, but 10,000 square feet of canopy it's still a healthy brand if you're branding all of the flower out of that space, and we would rather continue to expand at that scale, 5,000 square feet at a time, and we think that as the market, continues to evolve, that's going to be fairly attainable for us. But, as far as drying, our approach towards drying goes, we have that as a philosophy where we try to stay as close to 60 and 60 for, 10 to 14 days or so. We keep the same temps in our trimming and processing zone so that we really finish off that cure before everything gets into the jar. And, a lot of people can, they want to move flower around to get to a certain dry room, or they have to because they're growing so much that they're growing it in Coachella and drying it in Salinas, so you're throwing it all in and box trucks and transporting all this. Like, that's some insight into the like big ag California world, where like, it's eventually a lot of that product will probably drive the consumer expectation in the market, once the federal laws really come down and the California greenhouses are able to produce product for the rest of the country, But until then, I would rather keep my drying facilities, specific to any one cultivation facility. I can take it all post-drying, and trim it and process it anywhere. But transporting it, presents too much risk for me. I don't have the stomach for it. So I want to be able to dry it on site, take it straight from the grow room directly to the dry room. And after that, then you have a little bit more forgiveness in transporting.
Totally. Yeah, it sounds like a logistics nightmare.
Yeah, definitely.
So as someone who's been one of the main pioneers in vertical farming, if we have a listener who's, maybe a single tier HPS person, or someone who's just thinking about getting into the cannabis industry, what is like one sage tip of advice that you would give someone like that?
Again, my first step is always in environmental control, HVAC design and airflow, and making sure that you're sizing everything adequately, you're designing your supply adequately, and implementing the right amount of airflow throughout the space.
Seems to be pretty consistent messaging from people who've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
So there's obviously something there. Where can people visiting California or in California find your products? And is there any other things about Fog City brand that you want, or any cultivars that people should keep an extra eye out for
Sure.
the future?
Yeah, we've got our Pacific Gas, our Pacific Chemistry. Those are both very kind of rooted in that OG lineage. Our Deep West Mango Cut is out there. That's the strain that we bred out in Maui with my family out in Maui. That's a sorbetto, lemon skunk, tangy, and Scots OG cross. That's a super interesting one.
Rare dankness.
And then there's other genetics that we're constantly bringing to see how well they fit into the fold. We're going to be doing some work with Finest Genetics this year to develop some stuff. Down in Southern California, Haven is one of our premier partners. From a retail perspective, go visit your local Haven for your Fog City products down there. In the Santa Cruz region, The Hook is one of our great partners in Santa Cruz. And if you're in the Bay Area, you can check us out at Barbary Coast.
Nice.
Barbary Sunset is specifically one of the spots that carries us up there. So, among others, but those are the first that come to mind.
Awesome.
So,
Very
yeah.
cool. But James, it's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. I know we'll be talking more, so I'll say until the next episode.
Right on, man.
All right, brother.
Pleasure.
Appreciate
Thank
you.
you very
Thanks,
much,
brother.
man.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks for listening to Cultivation Elevated. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at pipphorticulture.com/podcast. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/cultivation elevated. We'll be sure to read these out on future episodes.